have to tell you, I am so excited about our special guest today. We are going to learn a ton of just outstanding, life-changing stuff. Bruce May has been in law enforcement for 35 years as an NYPD patrol officer and detective, a victim advocate and counselor, and now head of the EAP, Employee Assistance Program, of a large law enforcement agency. Bruce is a licensed clinical social worker who has worked with the Visiting Nurse Service, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and the Health and Hospital Corporation of New York City. Bruce has a master's in clinical social work, postgraduate certification in cognitive behavioral therapy, and a private practice which specializes in resilience training. Bruce's work has always made me think of him as a real life superhero, but it's his role as my husband that makes me especially proud. Yep. I'm so grateful that my awesome husband, Bruce May, has agreed to share his incredible insights as a resilience expert with us today. Bruce, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your extremely hard-earned, tremendous knowledge and insights.
Well, thank you, Virgie, and thank you for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. Nepotism is alive and well in the Bright Ellington May household. Thank you.
Seriously, you know I'm honored and privileged to have a front row seat to the lives that you change and save, Bruce, with your superhero level resilience work. So thank you again for taking the time to share it with us.
Well, I'm so happy to be here and be part of this wonderful process that you have. And hopefully your readers by the end of this talk will have a different perspective about resilience and the role it plays in their lives and how to actually be more resilient. But before I do, and before I forget, I do have to make one disclaimer that everything presented here, the opinions are my own. They're not of my employer, my wife, my mother-in-law, or anybody else.
Will do. Noted. Thank you, Bruce. So, all right. So let's start with explaining what is resilience, and two, why is it so critically important to health and wellness?
Well, it's thank you for opening with that, because resilience now in this day and age, where I think the wellness industry is a several $billion-a year industry, and everybody wants their sort of piece of the pie with this. And wellness and resilience are used very interchangeably, and different definitions of resilience have come up. What I've learned in my work and my practice is that the research is really clear. There is a very distinct difference between wellness and overall resilience. Now, you could be resilient in specific ways, but what I'm here to talk to you guys about is being resilient as a whole body. How is your whole being? Can we get your whole being to be more resilient? So well-being is really a state of mind, and it's sort of like if you meditate or you do like deep breathing exercises, and you feel good about that. That's great. That is positive. But if you do those things and later on you're faced with some sort of adversity and we're not able to overcome that adversity, well, that's the difference between wellness and resilience. Resilience allows you to overcome adversity, and not just in the way we think about resilience right now. Is in the past it was psychological resilience, mind over matter, but really it's matter over matter. It's your whole entire being that we're trying to immunize, if you will, make stronger, make hardier, to be able to not only overcome adversity, but also grow from it, right? It's good that we can do things, that will help us get through adversity. But what if we're able to do things that not only get us through adversity, but also make us better human beings, physically, health-wise, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. So that's the kind of resilience that I want to talk to you and your readers about today. And that's the focus of the work that I do. But to kind of give it a perspective of why this is important is we have to kind of all have an agreement. And I think you would agree, and I think your readers would agree, that if we really looked at our lives, the universe really is trying and really is conspiring to kill us. And I don't mean to be glib about that, right? I really do believe.
That sounds really scary, Bruce, and kind of depressing.
It is, but it's something, even Darwin, in his theories of evolution and natural selection, came up, well, he didn't actually come up with he referenced someone who came before him, the survival of the fittest. And those that could survive and adapt were then led to procreate, and their species began to live on. And, that's in the natural world. There's no debate about that. We're fortunate that we as human beings have come up in ways in which we can sort of overcome the natural selection process, but that process still exists. And that's what makes us miserable. If we're not able to overcome and adapt, well, then the universe is not going to reward us for that.
So if we have to learn how to overcome and adapt to the stressors in our environment.
Well, yeah. And when we look at stressors, we sort of categorize that under adversity. And anything, even if we don't realize they're stressors. For instance, there's stress, right? And there's something called eustress. So stress has the negative connotation, like if you're riding on the subway, often like I do, and you get the rats are jumping over your feet, or the loud noises or the crowds, that's stress. That's
negative stress.
And that's negative stress. And then we have eustress, which is sort of the positive stress. Having a baby,
getting
finding
married,
your life partner, getting married, having a doctor with her own radio show. All of this stuff, is really good stress, right? However, our minds and our body they don't know the difference. They don't know the difference between good stress and bad stress. The response is still the same. So the universe is constantly trying to push us and constantly trying to select the most resilient of us. And we've come to the point in our evolution in which we can adapt, in a sense, through medicine, science, and we're not going to die off, but that adversity has a negative effect on us. Heart disease, overweight, depression, anxiety, these things come out through our responses to, among other things, right? Adversity. So when we look at resilience, we look at, well, where does it come from? Right? It would be nice to sort of understand if there is a possibility, right? It's really depressing, like you said, if the universe is conspiring to kill us, and we can't control that. It's inevitable that's what's happening. I would humbly disagree. And
you would disagree with what?
That there's nothing we can do. That the universe is conspiring to kill us.
And so you're saying you disagree that there's nothing we can do about that.
Right. It's not left up.
I can't just say, oh, that's life. There is something that we can do about that.
Right. We're not leaving things up to fate. We're not leaving things up to the universe. We're not leaving things up to nature. We are the only beings on this earth that have the capability to adapt and control our environment. And in resilience building, that's exactly what we're doing.
So then how do we become resilient if, as humans, we have the choice to be able to learn how to become resilient and or build our resilience muscles. As the way I'm thinking of it, the analogy is, if we have, as humans, we have the choice of building our resilience muscles. How do we do that? How do we become resilient? How do humans become resilient?
Well, it's a good point to make, that we do have that ability, but resilience, when we look at resilience now, the model in which I train in and I teach others to train in is that resilience can be trained. It's a trainable thing, and it's like going to the gym kind of training. Whereas you want to develop a specific muscle group, you train that muscle group, you have a strategy to enhance that particular muscle group, you engage time and time again, repeatedly with that muscle group, and then you have a metric. Am I getting stronger? Are my muscles getting bigger? But in resilience, we do the same thing, but in a more global way, if you will. But it is important to, if we're going to think about training, even if it's something like weight training for muscles, we have to know where we are at the beginning, right? And there are basically three ways in which we can become resilient. And the first one, we have no control over, pretty much, and that's our genetics. Just like muscles, it's the genetics. And through eons and eons and eons, maybe of behavior, our ancestors who were able to overcome and adapt. This is very much like the evolution theory. That has been encoded in our genes. The good stuff, like the hardiness of, think back of how our families, everybody's families, have endured over the eons and were able to get to this point in which I could get to sit here in front of you in this nice home on this computer, whereas a couple generations ago somebody was doing some serious manual labor. So that has been encoded, the good stuff and also the bad stuff, the things that make us less resilient, things that make us more prone to disease and that kind of stuff. So genetics play a huge role in how the beginnings of our resilience. But the interesting thing, and what's come about recently, is the science of epigenetics. And epigenetics is, because we can't really change our genes, although science is getting pretty close with CRISPR and stuff, but we can change how our genes are expressed. And this is the beginnings of developing a training plan. We have to know where we are in order to know where we want to go. And I look at epigenetics, that expression of our genes. Like, if I have a propensity for high blood pressure, it's in my genes. I have a genetic propensity for it. I can change how that is expressed by taking high blood pressure medication and reduce how that gene is expressed in the real world, and have the ability to do that. So having a good sense of sort of my genetic resilience, where I am on resilience genetically, the things that I need to work on, the things that I can capitalize on, is very important. The second way in which we develop resilience, whole human resilience, right? Not just psychological resilience, is through our experiences. And there is a saying, I hate to be corny, but there is a saying that says, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And when we look at the science of positive psychology now, that's exactly what happens. We know that people who suffer adversity, stress, develop post-traumatic symptoms. And those symptoms can sometimes lead to a psychological disorder called post-traumatic stress disorder. But not everybody does, right? You can have the post-traumatic stress symptoms, but not develop the disorder. Can resilience be one of those factors that may determine whether or not one person eventually suffers the disorder or not? Yeah, I believe so. It's one factor at least. But what we do know that the science is telling us right now is that those who overcome, those who suffer from post-traumatic stress, overcome and adapt, they then go through something called post-traumatic growth. And that growth can be symbolized in some way, can be analogized in some way to resilience. So if a person experiences events, we're going to keep using the word adversity, and they overcome that through adaptation, then what the science tells us is that they will grow. And we need that. We actually do need to face adversity just in general growth. And we found that out actually through accident. I don't know, Virgie, if you remember back in the 80s, they were doing some experiments in the desert, something called the biodome, right? They wanted to see if human beings can thrive within an enclosed environment so that we can colonize maybe the moon or Mars or that kind of stuff. They put some folks, these brave folks out there, I think in the Arizona desert, in these sort of clear domes that were self-sufficient. They had food, they could grow their own crops. They had everything that they needed in this self-contained environment. But what they found was that after a few years of growth, the trees in this environment would just fall over. And they did everything to kind of try to figure out, why is it that in this environment, these trees after a couple of years were falling over? They gave them all the nutrients that the trees needed. They gave them a space in which to grow, height in which to grow, sun that they needed. They basically gave them the Maslow's law of everything, except these trees didn't become self-actualized. They fell over. Mm-hmm. And after a few years, they figured out why. And the reason why was because there was no wind. There was nothing there to challenge these trees. And who knew, until you do an experiment like that, trees needed to go through this adversity, these challenges of wind, so that they can build this type of wood to go against gravity and then grow. It was an integral part of their growth to face adversity. It's the same with us. We do need to face adversity, overcome and adapt. It's when that adversity outpaces our ability to overcome and adapt, and then we suffer things like post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. What resilience training
I think of when you tell that story, Bruce, I think of in terms of the human analogy is having your wing muscles develop, right? If you have no stress, you don't have anything for your wings to fight against. Your wings become stunted. They don't grow. Your wing muscles atrophy. They don't grow. They become stunted. And so it is developing a muscle. The analogy I think of when you tell the story is that resilience is building a muscle, that humans actually have wings. And if we don't have anything pressing against it, like wind, right? The stress of wind, it could be eustress, good stress or bad stress, but some kind of stress against it for the wings to work against, they don't develop, and we can't fly and soar and be who we're supposed to be. Am I on target from your perspective with that analogy? I don't know if we talked about this before. Did we talk about the way I look at it when you tell me resilience stories?
Maybe.
I don't remember if we talked about this before.
I will add to your analogy that it does take a certain amount of muscle strength.
Yeah.
To fly, right?
Yeah.
And that could be analogous really to resilience. And there is grounding sort of experiences in the real world for human beings. We use the tree, and we use, hey, the sort of the analogy of wings. But in my work, we can see that in my past work, we're working with victims. We can see really how resilience plays into our lives. And I remember a case that I was working with victims on. It was a very large financial fraud case where it was a Ponzi scheme in which you had to be able to invest at least $1 million to get into it. It was one of the most notorious financial fraud schemes in our history. And many, 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 many victims lost millions and millions of dollars. And I remember working with two particular victims of this scheme. And because in order to get into this scheme, you had to have a minimum of $1 million. Those who did not were pulling their resources together in order to get the entrance amount. And a lot of churches and organizations did that. I remember working with a woman who did that in her church. Her church pulled money from the parishioners together in order to invest on behalf of them. And this woman did that in her church. She invested all of her savings, her whole entire assets, which was about $20,000. It was sad because she was about 86 years old at this time, African-American woman with no surviving family. She was alone. That loss, that $20,000 represented her entire net worth, everything, aside from the little Social Security that she was getting. And, when I talked to her, she told me about her life, working manual labor pretty much her whole entire life. She was a daughter of a sharecropper, grew up in the Jim Crow South. And those of you who know your history knows that it was very difficult to be African-American during that time. And really, I think she was less than a generation away from slavery. And she had very limited access to, other services, like therapy and healthcare and that kind of stuff. And it was really sad, working with her. And then there was another victim who was able to actually, he was a lot more well off, a Caucasian male in his 40s. He was married with a child, came from, not a rich family, but, not a poor family. Worked very, very, very hard, studied, struggled, got into a decent school. His loss was about $1 million, but it only represented about 10% of his net worth. So he had about 10 million of assets. He ended up, working extremely hard, paying his way through school, getting an MBA from a pretty decent university, got the scholarships to get there. He ended up, obviously being a high income earner, and he had access to therapy and healthcare and such. Now, I tell you about those two victims of this crime and their background to kind of illustrate how experiences in our lives may determine our ability to overcome and adapt and our level of resilience. And I would say the greatest example of the antithesis of resilience, and I said it kind of darkly earlier, is death. And one of these two actually took their own life.
Died by suicide.
Death by suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And one would say, well, it was the older African-American woman, because all of the things that she went through in her life and the little bit of resources that she had, but it wasn't. It was the male who had all the resources. And it wasn't that he grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth, but just look at the experiences of he struggled, right? But did he face the same adversity? That's the key. He worked hard, he did that. But did he face the same kind of adversity, overcome it, and adapt to it like the elderly woman did? I would venture to say that, if we're able to measure resilience, the one that had the most experiences, the most experience with adversity, and the greatest, the most detrimental, in a sense, type of adversity, grew to have the most resilience. Now that tells us something, but it also poses a problem for us in resilience training, is that how do we train that? How do we, if we're just a product of our experiences, and we're just a product of our genetics, well, how do we then have the ability to train in resilience? Because it would be unethical, really, right, to put people through horrible experiences with the hopes that they will come out okay,
that they'll develop their resilience wings. Yeah, that would be totally an unethical study,
because some of them won't.
Exactly.
Right.
So then how do we become resilient? You said genetics, which we don't have control over, our experience, which we largely don't have control over. What's another way that we can become resilient then?
We can have control over a different type of experiences, and that's in training.
So resilience training, you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's not just any training. What the research and the science is telling us is that, we can build overall resilience by training in 5 core areas. The first one is physical fitness. And that seems kind of commonsensical, right? Okay, I think most people think, in a sense, resilience can be somewhat equated to being stronger. And if you train in physical fitness, you'll be physically stronger. You'll also, have some hardiness in psychological and emotional fitness. Training does hit those areas as well. It does hit health. And by the way, emotional and cognitive fitness is the second one. Health is the third one. And I said it that way purposely because I want to give your readers the idea that all of this is enmeshed together. They're 5 separate areas, but they're all touching each other.
5 separate areas of resilience training.
Right, that we want to hit separately. However,
to
they
be able
all
to
hit each other.
To be able to develop resilience, we do resilience training, and that is comprised of 5 parts.
Right, physical fitness.
Physical fitness is 1.
Mental and emotional hardiness
is 2. Emotional
health hardiness.
Mental hardiness. 3 is health hardiness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Being healthier, as healthy as you can be.
Okay.
Spiritual and purposeful hardiness. Knowing why you are here. You have a purpose. It can be, but not necessarily religion. It is, for certain, purpose and spirituality.
That's number 4.
And the 5th.
Okay.
And the 5th is social hardiness, your interactions with your fellow human beings. And I would venture to say that if I were to separate all 5 of those things, they're all 5 important in their own way. But social hardiness is probably one that we don't really focus on a whole lot. When we meditate, when we go to church, we think about spirituality, we see our doctor and get checkups. We could do more, but we do that. We may, if we're feeling depressed or anxious, we may seek counseling or therapy. And of course, we know that working out is important, and we may do that. But how many of us think specifically that, hey, I've got to get more friends. I've got to develop these social connections. I've got to develop not only the social connections, but the strength and the depth of those social connections. So it's those 5 areas that when we talk about resilience training, we want to be able to strategically address. And that's important. We want to, they may be interrelated, right? You may feel good while you're working out. You may get a health benefit or while you're working out. So they're sort of related to each other. But strategically, what we want to do is ensure that every single day we are addressing all 5 areas. And it could be very simple. And where you may want to do one thing a day of physical fitness. It could be 10 squats a day. As long as it's targeting, you're telling yourself that's the strategy for this particular one. It's got to be measurable, right? I'm going to do 10, and then I'm going to do 20. It certainly has to be achievable. You don't want a goal of doing that kind of stuff where you're not able to. If you can't do 10 squats, trying to do them right away is counterproductive. We have to be able to, when we train in this thing, to develop it as a habit. It has to be repeatable. And of course, it should be evidence-based, tested. That's the SMART, S-M-A-R-T, strategic, measurable, achievable, repeatable, and time-tested. I add the R, which
What's the
smarter,
R?
Smarter.
What's the smarter? What's the R?
Smarter. It must have a high return on the investment.
Can you give us an example of that?
Absolutely. So if you pick an activity, you want to pick an activity, although it's specifically targeting one of the 5 core areas, you want to be able to relate to the others. For instance, let's say I want to develop my spiritual hardiness, and I will practice deep breathing every day, sort of like this mindfulness exercise, right? Very common nowadays. In other terms, that deep breathing is called diaphragmatic breathing. It's a different type of breathing physically, and it addresses different physiological areas, but it does attend to our spirituality. So I'm going to do diaphragmatic breathing to attend to my physical hardiness. Well, the return on the investment is that it also helps with my emotional and cognitive hardiness. Studies have shown that diaphragmatic breathing reduces stress. And if I do that, well, I'm actually hitting 2 now of the 5 areas of resilience training. Also, studies have shown that practicing diaphragmatic breathing is good for our health. It reduces our blood pressure. It has an effect of increasing oxygen in our body. So it also attends to the health part of resilience training, although I'm only doing it to target my spirituality. The last one, well, second to last one, is physical hardiness. And the studies have shown now that diaphragmatic breathing, because of the physiology involved in that type of breathing, actually increases your core strength because of the relationship between your diaphragm and the underside of your spine. So with that one, now if you do it as a group, by the way, you hit them all.
You hit social. You hit number 5.
Right, that's right.
There you go.
Right. You do that in a group setting, right? You go to the temple like I do, and, right, and do your diaphragmatic breathing. You hit them all in one shot. But even if you don't want to sit with a bunch of monks, because sometimes they're kind of boring, they don't have a life, you can't tell dirty jokes in front of them. You hit 4 out of the 5, and that's the return on the investment. And then you do a different one for your health, you do a different one for your emotional and mental health, your physical hardness, and social. So, and it almost happens. I guarantee you, if you pick one thing and you target it, I can almost tell you every single time that it will impact another area of resilience. That's just the way it works. The key then, if you're doing 5 things, small, right? Diaphragmatic breathing is very small. It takes you 10 seconds, really, to do 10 diaphragmatic breaths. It has huge benefits, but you do that every day. You do other exercises that attend to those 5 other areas every day, could amount to maybe 30 to 45 minutes a day of your entire day. You have a huge, now because they're all interrelated, a huge return on that investment of time and energy.
Good stuff. Good to know. So I have to ask, how did you come to do this work of resilience training, Bruce? I know a little bit, I know some of it. I feel like I know some of how you came to do this work that you're sharing with us. And thank you so much for sharing this information, because it was hard earned. It was very, very hard earned, these insights that you're sharing. Can you tell us about how you came to do resilience training?
You know, part of it was sort of not voluntary. On my
It goes
part.
to the 3 parts of resilience, right? That we don't have
Right.
control over: genetics
Exactly.
and experience. So genetics,
Exactly.
whether or not you are a member of the Lucky Sperm Club; experience,
Right.
what happens to you when you're young and have no control over things. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So we look at the genetics, and you know, my parents and grandparents came to this country through not really voluntary. You know, they were fleeing persecution, death on their heels, and getting here was not easy. Living where they came from was not easy. And their parents and their parents' parents and their parents' parents' parents, same thing, until finally they got to me. I have it very easy compared to them. But their genetics, their hardiness, their resilience is in there. What's also in my genes is this propensity for high cholesterol and the risk of heart disease. And the thing that wars could not kill my father from, oppression could not kill my father, heart disease did him in. And that's the genetic part in me. And both of my older brothers had heart attacks, and it's something that I struggle with all the time. So I have to be very, very mindful of that. Use the skills of epigenetics to show how that particular gene is expressed. So far, thankfully, it's been good, but it is something that other people don't have to deal with. And yeah, doing it has had its benefits. I'm here
what,
right now,
Bruce?
talking.
Doing what?
Well, having that sort of genetic predisposition in those experiences, right, and the strengths, but also being able to use epigenetics to
And epigenetics, can you tell us again? Explain epigenetics again.
It's how our genes are expressed.
Mhm.
So, for instance, in my case, I have a genetic disposition for high cholesterol. That high cholesterol leads to heart disease and to my early demise. So, just to leave it alone, I would probably not be here right now. But I've been able, through science and medicine, be able to alter how that gene is expressed by taking medication.
So how do your environment and stresses, good and or bad, impact on your genes, the expression of your genes, of your DNA?
Right.
Okay.
And then, of course, there are experiences, right? Growing up poor, having those challenges, overcoming those challenges, also contributed to my hardiness as well. And I didn't think that was happening, but as I was able to move through my life and overcome, being a neglected child, having to go to work at 12 years old, putting myself through school, dodging the drug dealers in my neighborhood because I grew up in the project, all those things, getting over that, things started to happen in my life. And it started to happen because I was getting stronger. My resilience was growing because I was overcoming and adapting to those adverse experiences. So that sort of set me on that track. But my experiences in my profession really got me to develop what you see right now, or you'll soon see, in resilience training. And it's going back to working with victims of crime. And there are some victims of crime, unfortunately, that we know, and to some extent we just agree on, that we just settle on, that they're not going to accept services. There is a sort of common notion that domestic violence victims always go back to their abusers, kind of stuff. And in the work that I did, we had, unfortunately, very, very difficult, horrific stories of people being victimized, cases like human trafficking. And I remember in 2016 working on a case in which we were posing as Johns to target what we thought were victims, well, targeting the Johns, the traffickers who were victimizing minor female victims, and because we wanted to see if we can recover them. And in 2016, we were able to recover 2 human trafficking minor victims. And my job at the time was to provide the services that they needed post-recovery. So after they recovered, the bad guy was arrested, they come into my care. I provide them through my network of NGOs, services, basic things, food, clothing, shelter, all that stuff. And the thought was, if we can provide the basic necessities, and if you remember Psych 101, Maslow's law kind of stuff, that they will then move towards going on their own and self-actualization kind of stuff.
So you provide them with food, shelter, water, according to Maslow's law, the basic necessities. Then they will have what they need to be able to safety. Then they'll be able to have what they need to achieve self-actualization.
Right. And if not, those things in between. So at the very least, they have the resources that they don't have to go back to their abuser.
Mm-hmm.
Well, unfortunately, all of the training up until then was, the odds was that they will go back. And for me in that, it was not really acceptable, and did everything that we knew at the time to do. And in fact, really vetted and sought and encouraged these social service agents to provide even more. I mean, the NGO that, in this particular case, we were able to get these 2 young women in, provided all that, a wonderful, wonderful housing environment, clothing, great food, health services, top-notch stuff. And even social things. Like, I remember I went to go visit them a couple of days later, and they were baking pies. It was a great environment. But unfortunately, a few days later, I get a phone call from the NGO, and they ran from the location, not to be found again. And this was very typical. It was like, okay, I don't know. There was nothing really in the research other than that's what happens. Fast forward in 2018, well, in between going on to many other cases, same thing over and over and over again. In 2018, we do another operation trying to target minor victims of human trafficking. We again were very fortunate to recover 2 females, 2 female victims, 2 female minor victims of human trafficking. And when I get to meet them, I'm like, you seem very familiar to me. And as you can imagine by now, it was those same 2 minor victims from 2 years ago, 2016. One of them was still a minor
Mm.
2 years later. Now, they were very cooperative. They told me everything, all of their experiences, horrible things that happened to them in the 2 years since we recovered them initially. And it was heartbreaking. I was beside myself thinking, what could have I done differently so that these two young women did not have to go through again the horrific things. I won't go specifically for your readers here, but what could have I done differently? So I made it my purpose to think about what are those things that we could have done differently. I hit the research and I expanded the research to not only the social sciences, the psychology, marketing, everything that I could think of. And what came up over and over again, but not specifically, right? There was no research about the link to resilience and the propensity for victims to stay in treatment or not in treatment, but it was there if you look for it. And what I asked these, after that, I started asking the NGOs to do was to look at those 5 core areas of resilience and see if they can, in addition to all the wonderful things they were doing already, because they were really doing some really good stuff. But in addition to that, look how we can address their physical hardiness. Look to see how we can increase their health hardiness, their spiritual and purposefulness, their social hardiness, and their mental and emotional hardiness. And they began, little programs here and there to kind of address that. And there's where the ROI comes in, because they're very little things, right? And what we found was that the stays in the NGOs were longer, so that whereas on the average, a human trafficking victim would run. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to say this. When I interviewed those 2 girls, I asked them, well, what happened the last time? Why did you leave? And they told me, well, there was lights out at 10:30. We couldn't smoke when we wanted to smoke. We didn't have access to our phones all the time, right? And my colleagues are thinking, this is crazy.
Is this why they ran? Really? That's what they're thinking. Yeah, really?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when we look at it with the lens of resilience and adversity and their background, well, the idea that they had to go to bed at 10:30, that they couldn't have their phone, that they had to smoke at certain areas, all that stuff could be defined as adversity. Those things to them are adversity. They did not have the ability to overcome and adapt to that. So when I did the research, that was the question in my mind. How can we train these folks instead of just saying to them, hey, it makes sense. Why would you do this? Why would you go back to that when you can have this? Not listening to them and understanding that they did not have the capacity to overcome and adjust to what their experience is. To us, when I'm on a crowded subway train, yeah, it's adversity, but I can somewhat easily overcome that. For them, because of their experiences, right, the genetics experiences, right, they didn't have the ability to overcome that type of adversity. So it makes sense then to target their ability to overcome and adjust to adversity, not just to try to convince them that what they're doing is wrong and we have a better way of doing things. So that's how I targeted the research. I opened up to research in every area that I could, and we came up with and the research is clear, it's 5 areas. So I went back to the NGOs. I said, hey, they didn't really understand what I was doing, but why not?
They're like, let's go with it. Okay.
Let's go with it. You know what? There's no harm in doing it. You cannot harm somebody by training in resilience.
That's right.
This way. So I convinced some of them to do it. Others did not. I had my control group unknowingly, unwittingly. So the ones that did, we had longer stays.
Mm.
right? And in some cases, we had those who actually stayed. So I thought I had something going on over here. So I said, well, I think we have something here. I'm a clinician. I'm not a researcher. I read research and I try to apply the research. I don't do the research. So I said, how do I know this is actually going to work? How do I know resilience training will work? So I experimented on myself.
Uh-oh. Now we need to hear about that. So Bruce, can you come back next week and talk to us about resilience training on ourselves? You used yourself as a subject. This is going to be good stuff. I have to tell you, I feel like you were holding out on me because you didn't tell me that you were applying research on yourself, that you were being your own guinea pig, that you were applying the 5 steps of resilience training on yourself until we talked about, look, you're doing this amazing things. You've got to share it with the world. We got a lot to talk about next week.
All you saw was the results, Virgie.
Yes. I can vouch for that. They're pretty awesome results. Thank you, Bruce.
See you next time.
I'll talk to you next week. Thank you so much.